So I've been meaning to post about my religious history and how how I grew up, or gives an idea of how I grew up and how it's affected me and where I'm at now when it comes to faith and spirituality and religion. Um, and I've had this outline of a post sitting in my drafts for about a year now. And I just haven't found, I don't know what, the drive or the push to actually finish this post and put it up. Um, and so I decided to try to make a video. And this particular video was catalyzed by something that I saw on Facebook. Um, a friend of well a classmate of mine from high school posted as her status that another classmate of ours from high school has just joined a religious order. She just joined a sisterhood, um, and it was very seeing that was very, I mean, it wasn't shocking really, because she was always a very devout person. um, but it was just something that pushed me to rethink my history and think about how close I was to following in her footsteps. Because I, for a very long time, considered joining an order as well and becoming a Catholic sister. I'll just try to give some sort of like information on who I was, and I guess who I am, because who I was really affects that. So I grew up a devout Catholic until I was about 15 years old. I was schooled with Catholic doctrine since I could speak, through songs and things of that nature. My parents sang me Catholic songs and we prayed. I knew all the prayers before I started school. By kindergarten, I was taking actual religion classes that were incorporated into my curriculum, so they counted for my school average. The grades were on my report card. And I mean, I guess when you're young, it wasn't that in depth. It was mostly pictures, but it was like a simplified version of the Bible, which is what we did. And like started understanding like the practices and traditions of the church and the sacraments and things of that nature, and what is a sin, and things like that. By the fifth grade, I think it's safe to say that I knew the Bible inside and out, and I knew what the church believed on specific things. And I guess you could say that I was a mini Catholic evangelist, I guess, or I think what the word I mean, an evangelist works, a message spreader. I was the type of person who would talk about the word and talk about God and talk about Jesus and talk about why being a Catholic was a great thing to be. Um, I was the type of person who would pray before every meal, and I was the type of person who would pray before leaving in the morning, like pray for a safe trip, pray for a good day of school, pray for a nice car ride, pray for my a good lunch, pray for this, pray for everything. I would sit and I would pray, and I would call it talking to God, as a kid, for long amounts of time that usually kids don't sit down and just do nothing with. I really was praying and I really was conversing with God. By fifth grade, you would say that I was a fervent believer and supporter of the church and its message or messages. I was an altar server. After the second grade, that's when I got my first communion. So I think it was in the third grade. I was 8 or 9 years old. I became an altar server. Um, and so I knew the mass, and I knew the mass. I knew every word that the priest would say. I used to breathe on that homily. I used to live for the priest's homily, and I used to memorize. Like I used to remember everything he said, and I used to spit it out. And just like thinking about it now brings back this feeling of like warmth and happiness and safety that like I don't feel anymore. Like I have to say that the church was the part of my life that brought the most stability, and it brought the most happiness, and it brought the most sanity to my life. Um, and I wish I could have stayed. Um, by 13, I had received all of the main sacraments, so I was a confirmed Catholic. in the seventh grade, and confirmation is when you repeat the promises or the vows made when you were baptized to be a part of God's church, to be one of his supporters and one of his people. But you do that yourself, and it's as if like you're like solidifying or like cementing your Catholic membership. Um, by 13, I actually was not in my original Catholic primary school. So from kindergarten until the fifth grade, I went to a town parish primary school. But after the fifth grade, I switched to a more regional Catholic school for academic reasons. But the school that I switched to had definitely a much bigger and much stronger and much more solid um, Catholic um, body, Catholic background, Catholic essence. Um, the way that this new school approached Catholicism touched upon other like smaller evangelical type of ideas. So more song, more video, more interaction with the leaders, with the Bible, with each other. Because I think that before, my Catholicism was a bit more sterile and a bit more individualized, where it was you and God, and then you would just follow and you would just like carry out the tradition, say the right words at the right time, do the right movements at the right time, do the right like blessings and things. But when I went to my new middle school, it was definitely something where I felt that I was even more connected with God. I was singing with him. I was meditating. I was doing adoration. I felt like I was becoming one with God, one with Jesus, and it was definitely a great experience. So my school was a Marianist school, and the Marianists are a religious order of Catholic brothers and priests who believe that the best way to reach Jesus and reach God is um, the best way to reach them is through the intercession of Mary, the Mother. So the Marianists definitely pushed for like the idea of praying to Mary and worship and like not worshiping but like celebrating Mary and respecting Mary as our mother and the Lord's mother. So a lot of my teachers were brothers, a lot of my teachers were priests. So there was Father Philip, Brother John, Brother Roger, Father Francis, Father Albert, you name it. So in eighth grade, I was in office hours. I was sitting with Brother John. He was my religion teacher at the time, and I mentioned to him that I wanted to become a priest. And he looked at me a little confused, and he was like, "Why? You can't be a priest. You're a girl. You can be a nun or a lay person. Only men are priests." And I remember thinking to myself, "Oh, okay. So when I become a man, I can be a priest." Um, and that was probably the first time I think where I had like consciously thought about my transgendered identity. Um, that was the time when gender identity issues started to take a presence in my life. But I didn't really dwell on it too much. I had somehow found a way to separate my faith and my gender identity in a way that they did not conflict with each other. And I was able to think about them and expand on them and embrace them as much as possible without having them clash with each other. So I still stayed with the faith um, until I was like 16 years old. I had actually come to like the conclusion when I was a junior, like near the beginning of junior year, there were actually some sisters who came to visit our school and they did a presentation about their order and what they do and like their specific mission as sisters. I wish I remembered who they were. I think they were Dominican sisters. Um, and I was very moved and I felt this like push to join the sisterhood. And for a few months at that time, I really had decided that I was going to join the sisterhood right after graduating high school and I was going to do undergraduate studies, yes, but I would be a sister doing them. So I began real not like toying around or humoring are not even the words. I began more than considering the prospect of me becoming a nun because I knew that transitioning would destroy any hopes of me serving God, any hopes for me of serving God as a priest. Because by transitioning, I would be completely spitting on my body, which we were taught is the temple of the Lord. The body is one, a temple for Jesus Christ, like physically, as you take in the Eucharist every week or every day, which like I did. I took the Eucharist almost every day. Um, I would be disrespecting the Lord by changing my body in such a way, or disrespecting my body would be disrespecting his temple and disrespecting him. But even furthermore, the idea that our bodies were made in the image and likeness of God, and by saying that there's something wrong with your body, you are saying that there's something wrong with what the Lord made. And that was completely disrespectful and blasphemous. And I had accepted that, and I was prepared to shut down that part of my identity or let that go to serve the Lord. And I was prepared to become a nun. But it was during that time that the issues with the Catholic scandals of molestation were coming to a high point at in America, at least. I'm not too sure how it was in other countries, but this was around that time. And so things began happening that brought me to begin to question the magisterium and question the whole body of the church. I started to become, I guess many would say, a doubting Thomas. Thomas was one of Jesus's first 12 apostles, and he was the one who didn't believe that Jesus had risen, and he said that he wouldn't believe it until he had touched the wounds on Jesus's hands. And I think I began to become a doubting Thomas. And I told myself that I was still a Catholic and I was still Christian. I just had trouble believing things that I hadn't been able to see, touch, hear. And I began to explore ideas like Russell's Teapot, and I began to read pieces of work written by people like Dawkins, and I began to play around with ideas of agnosticism and secularism, and I really started to really toy around with things that would be considered blasphemous within the church. And while I was still exploring these things, I still kept to myself the thought that I still could possibly become a nun, that I would still be try to be ordained as the Eucharistic minister, which is someone who actually would be able to give out the bread and body, or the body and blood of Jesus, in mass and at communion ceremonies, but not really like perform the transubstantiation and perform the actual like changing of the bread and wine to body and blood. But they would actually be able to administer that. And I told myself that this like process of me questioning the teaching authority, the magisterium, questioning my teachers, and this whole scandal, all the scandals and all these questions and all these things I was reading by atheists and agnostics, I told myself that this was my form of like Rumspringa, which is like the Amish, some Amish teenagers have this, where they like are able to leave the Amish family, the Amish world, and explore the English world for a while to see if they want to stay. And I told myself that this was my version of it, and that I was testing out what the other options before deciding to completely give myself to the Lord. But during that time, during my, I think we'd say that I didn't go back. Um, as I started to question, more questions started to come up. And I remember sitting, and I remember I had a few months of turmoil trying to decide if I was going to become a Eucharistic minister or not. During that time, I started to accept more. I guess you'd say my transgender identity, my queer identity as a whole, began to take over the space that my Catholic identity had taken in my life. And I began to think about things like, if God made me this way, how can these people tell me that he doesn't like me? Like, God may have made my body, but he also made my intellect. He also made my brain. So the fact that in my mind my brain and my body didn't match was something that God must have done on purpose, correct? So how can how can the magisterium tell me that God does not approve of me if God made me like this? Um, I decided that by the end of my junior year, I decided that I was no longer Catholic, and I decided that I was going to transition. But I still believed in God, and I still believed in God. I only just felt alienated from the church.